Hey folks, Steve here with a World in Flames instructional video covering naval mechanics. This is going to be the first in a series that will probably last a few videos. Um, as opposed to land combat, which I feel like isn't typically a problem for folks. You got units and hexes, and they are usually stationary until they're not, and you just line them up in hexes and attack. Naval combat and naval movement and everything related to naval actions are a little bit more complicated and are definitely um, the one that can give some folks some trouble. And this is the probably most requested set of mechanics to get some sort of education or instructional help with. So I figured best to start here with my World in Flames coverage. I have covered a lot of content of Fatal Alliances, which is the World War I game in this system, and in my videos for that I have demonstrated and played out some of those naval mechanics. Many of those naval mechanics are going to be applicable here, so if you watch those videos or you've messed around with Fatal Alliances, a lot of this is going to be very similar, though knowing that because it's World War II, there are going to be some certain things that are different. Obviously, stuff like aircraft carriers are going to be much more prevalent here in a much bigger part of the picture. Now, this is being set up here so that this video is going to be hopefully on the shorter end and is going to cover really just the basics of the naval mechanics. And this means that this will be applicable for if you're just playing the base game, the classic edition, or if you're going to be playing the deluxe edition with ships and flames and all the optional rules and all of that. All of that stuff really sits on the same foundation of how all of this stuff works in terms of movement and how combat's initiated and all of that kind of stuff. So should all be mostly straightforward from that standpoint, whether you're playing either of those versions of the game. Now, some World War II games, when it comes to naval mechanics, represent things different ways. Sometimes they'll have all the oceans and seas of the world all be hexes, just like land are hexes, and you can do certain things. And the ships are going to be leaving port to go on specific missions, and then you complete those missions and they return to port. There's a bunch of different ways games represent this, and the way that World in Flames chooses to represent that is that because the turns of World in Flames are 2-month turns that are then broken up into back and forth impulses between the sides, and those impulses last, are basically representing a few days to at most a few weeks, or a couple of weeks. The game sort of has to give you the option of, taking some actions that are going to last a long time and allow you to end them within that turn, or even extend that beyond the turn. So in World in Flames, your ships are essentially either sitting in port doing nothing, or preparing to move out for transporting things or something like that, or they're out doing their naval missions. And being on a mission, so to speak, in this game just means they've left port and they're in a sea zone. And you can see here on my screen, I have the introductory Collector's Edition World in Flames Vassal module. This is available on the ADG website. You can download and open this up. It isn't the whole thing. It's only Western Europe set up for the invasion of France, but it's going to be sufficient for our purposes here today. The big Collector's Edition Vassal module is not out yet. But so if we look here, you can see there's the North Sea, there's Pharaoh's Gap, Bay of Biscay, Western Mediterranean, and so on and so forth. These are the sea zones that your naval units will be in. And you'll notice that the hexes stop. When you leave land, there's this coastal light blue hex, and then the hexes disappear into these dots. These hex dots are there to control distance, like if I'm going to fly a plane from here to here, I'm going to be going across water. Each hex dot is the equivalent of a hex, and you can kind of see the outline almost of a hex that would normally have been there. So, those help for that kind of movement, but naval units don't move from hex to hex to hex, for instance. They might move from port to port, but when they're out in the seas, if they're out there on a mission doing something, patrolling or what have you, they're going to be in the C zone. Now, these units don't sit out here like I've got these counters where I'm just sort of dragging them around here. That's not how this works in World in Flames. No, instead, these units are going to be in one of the 5 boxes. And of course, I'm going to have a heck of a time getting them in here properly because these counters are snapping to a grid that you can't see very well. But good enough. So, they're going to be essentially in these C boxes, either in the 1, 2, 3, 4, or even the 0 box. So these 5 boxes are where your units are going to end up. They're not typically you're not going to have your units out here in this empty space unless you're trying to do stack management in a real game, and the stacks of counters are just getting too high. So these C areas are sort of, their boundaries are land, and where they cross into another C zone, you've got a dark blue line. So in this game, the North Sea includes the English Channel because the barrier for the North Sea are over here, where it gets into the Baltic, over here, where it goes to the Faroes Gap, and then all the way over here, where it crosses into the Bay of Biscay. And so, if you're dealing with anything related to the channel, you're going to be looking at the North Sea being the sea zone for that area. Now, when it comes to movement, and what these sea zones really represent, think about it this way. They're not hard and fast physical locations, right? So you don't go like, I'm going to going from Newcastle to Amsterdam. You don't go out to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 to Amsterdam. You made it. That's not how that works. These sea zones are an abstraction of, I guess I'll say, patrolability. I'm not sure if that's a word. But it's basically a rating of how well your units are patrolling that sea zone. Because if they're out in that sea zone, they're either looking for a fight or they're looking to protect convoys that might be traveling through the sea zone. And we'll get to convoys in a later video probably, but just know that, yeah, there are going to be transport ships or convoys that are traveling through these sea zones, and they may need protection, escorts, or you might have your own fleets out here looking to fight an enemy fleet to clear open a sea zone, for instance. So I put together a little chart to kind of help explain what these sea zones really mean and how they work. So I made this in Paint, so bear with me. So think about it this way. The sea zone is all within this purple bordered oval, right? Sort of an abstraction here, so just humor me. That within this big purple outlined oval is the sea zone. And like any large body of water, there's a lot of space to cover. And in fact, a fleet of ships really isn't going to be taking up very much space in terms of water. There's a lot of space there. And so how you're able to navigate through here in terms of patrolling the waters is going to be a rating of, again, your sea box that you're in. So if you say 4, which is the best that you can be in, you're going to be in this blue oval that includes all the other things within it, right? So you're patrolling as good as the game will allow you to patrol. Your ships are moving all throughout the sea zone, and they're looking to find or they're looking to encounter enemy ships or what have you. The next rung down, 3, you're still patrolling pretty good in the sea zone, but you're not patrolling as good as the number 4 set of ships might be. And that continues on down to 2, to 1, and then finally 0. So if you're looking at Sea Zone 1, or Sea Box 1, I'm sorry, you're there patrolling, but you're not covering as much ground in a given amount of time as the person who's in the fourth C zone or C box. I keep mixing the two up. Fourth C box, right? You're not able to cover as much ground, right? Whereas that flotilla in the 4 box is getting all through here. You're simply not covering the same amount of ground. Now, if you're in the 0 box, that can kind of be looked at as having almost no patrolability in that C zone. In fact, the 0 box, in my mind, and the way I've tried to illustrate it here haphazardly, is when you're in the 0 box, you're kind of sailing a straight line through the C zone to get from point A to point B. That's why sort of this sort of straight line, you're not patrolling anything, you're just trying to get to where you want to be. So for convoys, for instance, traveling goods and materials, they're not out there looking for a fight, they're just trying to get from port to port. So they're going, no patrolling, they're just trying to get through the C zone. You can have escort ships also going, essentially from point A to point B, but not patrolling at all. And your ships may be doing that so that they are with the convoys who are doing the same thing. This is one of the other things that's kind of hard to represent, is that for the most part, all your units in a C box are going to be considered to be together. So if they end up in combat, then it might involve all of your ships in the 2 box. So they're going to be maybe not all sailing together, so to speak, but the abstraction here is that they're going to be together enough that they're operating as a stack, a flotilla. So you might have, like I have in Vassal, you might have a ship in every C box, and that they're operating independently of one another. They might still be able to help each other out in a combat that involves both of their C boxes. Or it could just be that only the ships in the 1 box end up in combat against the enemy. So that's why you might purposefully have your ships not be out patrolling a C zone like in the 4 box, but you might have them in the 0 box to basically be there with the convoys in case the convoys become involved in combat. Now, obviously, the con of that is that those ships with the convoys aren't necessarily going to be as good as finding the enemy or catching the enemy off guard because of that. And that's sort of part of the value in being in that higher level C box, being more out there patrolling the C zone, is that the higher the C box you're in, the greater advantage you will have in finding the enemy when it comes time to do search rolls for naval combat. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll always have the jump on your opponent. It may be that someone in the 2 box manages, due to the luck of a die roll, catch units in the 4 box by surprise, and they'll have an advantage in combat. It's just that those in the 4 box are going to have a greater chance of it being the other way around and finding the enemy. Now, from that perspective, you might say, well, Steve, I'm only going to put my ships in the 4 box if I'm going to patrol, and I'm only going to put my escorts in the 0 box, and that's just the way I'm going to do it. Why even have a 1, 2, 3? Well, the 1, 2, 3 boxes, and really all the boxes besides 0, are there as a function of, can your ships get to the C zone in question, and how much do they have in terms of ship speed and maneuverability to actively patrol? And so if you get to a C zone, and you have a lot of maneuverability, you're going to end up in a higher C box. So how does that work? Well, I included here a cutout from the counter description chart, and you can see I brought it over mostly to show the movement allowance and range. The orange circle is movement allowance, the yellow circle is range. Now, how this works is, obviously, the naval units, if you take a look at all the counters, are all going to have different value ratings. And most of the time, you're going to find that a ship's going to have a higher movement allowance than range, and that's sort of on purpose. You'll see why in a second. I don't think there are many cases where a range is higher than movement allowance, but it could occur, and there's sort of a way that would work out as well, which I'll get to here in a second. So let me demonstrate how this is going to work, right? So again, if you want to patrol well, You're going to be spending a lot of effort to do that. So let's look at the vassal module again. Now the way actual naval movement is going to work is that when you move a stack of naval units, that's going to be a naval move. So pay attention to your activity limits. But when you move from a port out to a sea zone, you immediately are spending a movement point and a range point. So if I had ships in Scapa Flow, them all leaving together is going to cost each of them one of their orange and yellow number here, just getting out of port to come to the North Sea Zone. They may still be planning on going to the Bay of Biscay, but they at least to get out to the North Sea need to spend one of each. Now if they did want to go to the Bay of Biscay, now they've spent a second point of each, both range and movement allowance. And if we look at these, that would mean if we moved all of these guys out to the Bay of Biscay, that everyone but the Nelson are going to have 2 of each left, while the Nelson's only going to have 1 range left. So the way this actually works is that the range is governing how far away from a base of operations, we'll say, your original base, the ship can go and still conduct operations. And that's sort of a representation of fuel capacity and fuel consumption, along with a little bit of ship speed given a certain amount of time. So, sort of contrasting that, your movement points are going to be the ship speed and maneuverability, and thus how much water can a ship cover given a certain amount of time. So kind of hard to make that totally clear, but think about it this way. If these guys all left Scapa Flow, and ultimately all they're really worried about is patrolling the North Sea, that takes less effort to get out to the North Sea and patrol it than it might take to go from the same port all the way down to the Bay of Biscay and then trying to patrol there, right? So the key to naval movement and naval operations in World in Flames is the closer you are to your home base when conducting naval operations, the more effective you'll be. I think that's the easiest way to say it. Closer you are to a base that you control and you've launched your naval units from, the more effective they'll be. The closer to the base, the more effective they'll be. Now, sometimes the circumstances may require you to send your ships very far from base to conduct operations. And what that's going to mean is that they're going to be much less effective at patrolling whatever sea zone it is that they're very far away from. Now, unfortunately, it looks like my vassal module has frozen. So, let's look at it this way. We'll do an actual naval movement so you can see what I mean. By moving out to here, that's using 1 of each. Now, because that's really close, all of these units now have 3 movement allowance left, the orange number. You can put ships into the C box of whatever their movement allowance is left by the time they get out to the sea zone. So leaving port uses 1 of them, but now all 4 of these units can now sit in the 3 box. And you say that's pretty darn good. They don't quite have enough movement allowance and range to make it to the 4 box because the ships just aren't as good, but you will find that there are ships that have higher movement allowance ratings, like 5 or higher, that will allow them to be placed in the very best box. But here, in just the next adjacent sea zone, they can go to the 3 box. So they're in pretty good shape. But if instead they were to travel out to the Bay of Biscay and do 1, 2, now they each only have 2 movement allowance left, which means they're going to be stuck in the 2 box. So imagine if you're fighting an enemy fleet, they're going to be much more eager to face you in home waters that, let's say it's fascist Spain or something. If they've got their navy in the 4 box and you've got to come all the way from Scapa Flow, you're going to end up in the 2 box. They're going to be an advantage in that way. And let's try maybe one more example. So this guy goes here into the 3 box. These guys go here into the 2 box. And then these 2 guys, and this would be in a naval move where we would have unlimited naval movement, are going to keep going. And we're going to go to Cape St. Vincent. So again, we go now all the way out here. Now here's the thing. The Nelson only has a range of 3. So by the time the Nelson gets out here, they can't go any further. To go any further would put too much stress on their fuel, is how I kind of look at it. And so he would have 1 movement allowance left. He could end up in the 1 box. But for the Resolution actually still has 1 of each left at this point. If they chose then to keep going, they've got one sort of tough decision to make. If they went to the Western Med, the Resolution would have no choice but to go to the 0 box. Again, very far away. So if this was an impulse or a turn, for the entirety of those couple of weeks or maybe those 2 months of activity, these ships are each spending their time differently, right? This ship left port and is patrolling heavily near home waters. This ship took more time getting farther out and thus can only patrol less effectively, not covering quite as much ground. Even worse down here, and then finally to the point where they're barely able to get into the sea zone, but they're not exactly patrolling, they're just sort of sailing their way through. A better option maybe for the Resolution would be to spend its final movement allowance and range to go to Gibraltar. Now when you finish a move like that, they're gonna whoops, no, don't be damaged. Well, we'll ignore that for a second. And we'll flip it. But if at some point later, either in another turn or what have you, this unit is reorganized and it comes back face up. I need to get rid of that. There we go. But if it comes back up now, it could go out to the Western Med and end up in the 3 box. Now there's one thing that's sort of tied up in this, in that if you leave a ship out at sea at the end of the turn, it's going to slide down 1 sea box. So from here to here, from here to here, and so on. And that kind of represents the fact that, if your ship's just continually on this mission for 2 months, maybe technically going back to port at some point, that just means that their fuel is going to be consumed, their supplies are going to be consumed to the point where, at least at the start of that next 2-month cycle, they're not going to be patrolling as well. They're going to have reduced patrol effectiveness until they can return to base and then be redeployed later. Now you might leave ships out to sea to help protect convoys or to maintain a presence. In other cases, you're just going to want to return them to base so that they can operate from a better port. So here, we might have the Nelson return to base to Gibraltar so that it can then come back out to the 3 box. In that sort of thing. So in terms of movement, again, the higher you are in your sea boxes, the better you are at patrolling the sea zone that you're in. versus your opponents who may not be as effective at finding you. With the zero space being for ships that are really just trying to get through the sea zone or have almost run out of gas, so to speak, or are protecting convoys. That's going to be in the zero box. And I think that's all I'm going to cover in this video. We're at about 25 minutes, which is pretty long, or 25 minutes of me recording. So I think we'll call that a video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit the like button if you'd like to see more, and in particular, more of these videos covering World in Flames naval mechanics. Hit subscribe. I'll look to do more of these here as time allows. The next video, we will get into a few more weird examples of movement conditions, and potentially get into some basic naval combat procedures and kind of how that works. So if there's something in particular you would like to see, leave a comment or send me a message or something, and I'll look to add it to the agenda. Otherwise, have fun, take care, and we'll catch you next time.